Be careful what you wish for. You just might get it. By request, I am doing a video on healing mechanics. And tying it in to my previous video on injury mechanics, like, it's difficult to make general statements about healing mechanics and what they should do or how they might work, or, you know, listing off examples. It's kind of difficult without talking about a specific system. Just for RPGs in general, the possibility space is too broad to make a lot of really meaningful statements. And it just kind of all boils down to what works for your game. In general, but this is a personal thing, I like healing mechanics that are easy to use, that feel effective, that are that keep you in the fight longer and for more time. You know, I don't mind characters going down as long as they can get back up easily, you know. So, for example, you know, D&D 4th edition has healing surges, which sometimes there are obstacles between you and using them. But for the most part, in my experience, a party's going to have access to being able to spend surges as needed. And when you do, you get back a quarter of your max health, plus probably some bonuses, depending on the thing that lets you spend them. So in that game, spending healing surges is a great way to get back up into fighting shape, because you probably aren't taking a quarter of your max health in a single hit. So that 25% of your max health is like literally, like, it's actually you standing up and like, I am back in fighting form, and I'm probably not going down again unless I get focus fired, which is probably what took you down in the first place. So I find 4th edition healing to be pretty good. It is limited per day, interestingly, in a game that mostly wants to push characters towards, like, doing longer adventuring days, or at least, you know, staying versatile for that. It is interesting that healing is almost universally in that system a daily resource. Your healing surges recover after a long rest. Nearly everything that restores hit points either spends a healing surge or otherwise is limited to a daily use. There are exceptions, of course, but for the most part, healing is a daily resource for 4th edition characters, which means that really is the limit, because, like, you can keep adventuring even if you've spent your daily attack powers, but if you don't have access to healing, you're done. Like, you gotta stop. You gotta find a place to rest. So that really is the hard cap on how long a D&D party can go on in 4th edition, is, you know, as long as we have access to healing resources. Because hit points are the most important resource, and so you have to be able to recover those. A lot of games, particularly those that use hit point mechanics, are going to treat healing as a attrition-based resource. I talked about this in my injury mechanic video, that there's an approach to hit points that, or there's an approach to health and, you know, general survivability that is based on attrition. It's like, you know, it's going to be basically like, I'm going to spend my survivability to stay in the fight while I reduce enemy survivability to 0. You know, and that is a very, very broad general terms description for nearly any system that utilizes hit points. You know, it applies to Lancer, it applies to Fabula Ultima, it applies to D&D of all kinds. You know, that's one way to approach it. I don't necessarily think that it's the most evocative way, particularly for narrative-based games. So, like, it's good for games that want to evoke the tactical aspect of RPGs. You know, Lancer, like, I don't think that there is a problem with Lancer using hit points. I don't think that it's a problem for D&D to use hit points, because these games are, you know, tactical RPGs. You know, when a fight breaks out, you're going to go down into, you know, grid combat, and you're going to be, you know, measuring out spaces. Like, it's a very heavy, crunchy kind of system, and so hit points kind of works for that. Not saying it's necessarily the best solution, but it kind of works for that. Fabula Ultima uses hit points because it is based on JRPGs. JRPGs almost universally use hit points or some very similar system. So hit points are fine. But when you do hit points, it kind of lends itself towards that attrition-based recovery. And if you're going to recover health in other ways, like, for example, in a game that uses injury systems or harm, like I talked about Blades of the Dark to some extent in my last video, not my last video, but my injury video. While I do like the way that Blades in the Dark's harm track fills up, I don't particularly like the way that it empties. And I got a comment on that video from Samtastic that mentioned that it's kind of a pain in the butt, especially early on when you don't have like a lot of resources to spend on downtime actions. It takes a lot of investment to recover from injury. And it's very difficult to outright avoid injury as low-level Blades of the Dark characters. And so it kind of works at a cross purpose to the stated goal, which is to have characters that are going to be taking risks and suffering consequences. Because if you take harm, what that means is, well, I'm not getting any downtime actions this session because I gotta have to spend them all recovering instead of doing the fun stuff like training or, you know, indulging my vice or working on long-term projects, which you can eventually afford to do, but in the early game you can't. And so I agree that the recovery system of baseline Blades in the Dark is not great. I think, I can't remember if it was ever, if John Harper ever suggested using this for Blades, but I know that in Scum and Villainy, they altered the recovery mechanic to be, instead of rolling and then filling up a healing clock, and then once the healing clock is full, all your harm kind of shifts down one level. They changed it to be you make a roll, and then based on that roll, everything from X level of harm down is gone. So like, you know, if you roll a 1 to 3, you just remove level 1 harm. You roll 4 or 5, you remove level 1 and 2 harm. You roll a 6, level 3 harm is gone. I'm pretty sure that's how it works. I'm trying to remember it just off the top of my head. I think that's how it works in Scum and Villainy. And that feels, honestly, to me like it's an updated version of the recovery mechanic. I think that John Harper and the oh man, I feel so disrespectful right now. It's so rude. I can't remember the name of the other guy who works on Scum and Villainy. I cannot think of the name. I'm sure there's a second name on there somewhere. Anyways, the developers, let me just be general about that. It feels very much to me like the developers understood the problems with their previous recovery mechanic and accounted for it and changed it and found this much more player friendly version of the recovery mechanic. So I prefer the Scum and Villainy version. For the reasons that I stated earlier, because it's easier for characters to get back on their feet, get back in the action. It's not this like long, arduous thing of recovery. Because on the one hand, yes, you want, like, I fully understand the desire to have a recovery mechanic where you're spending, you know, days or weeks in the hospital to emphasize how badly you are hurt, because this happens in fiction all the time. You know, your character who is, you know, probably combat focused gets into a fight with something and is put in the hospital, and so it takes time for them to recover. This happens, honestly, it's one of the better parts of like early Naruto, is when the characters are so gravely injured that for multiple episodes in the future, they're down. Like Rock Lee was in a cast for what, almost half a season or something like that. And that really drives home the point. Like, yeah, this was serious. Like it adds stakes to future engagements to know that this kind of thing can happen to your characters. I think in RPGs, it is much less interesting to have it that way. Because really what it is, if your character is in the hospital for multiple sessions, what are you doing as a player? You know, I'm not saying it's impossible to have interesting scenes in that context, but it's a lot harder, and it probably isn't part of your game's like core gameplay loop. So I think that recovery should be easy. Whatever kind of injury system you're using, I think that try to avoid player removal. And I'm going to get back to that in just a second, because I do want to say my other point, which is that once a character is like, once the danger is over, I think it's usually best to try to have some sort of recovery immediately so that characters get back on their feet. What you don't want your injury system to do is take away from the player the ability to play the game. Now, you have to have some stakes, of course. You know, I thought about this in Code World. Like, I don't want, I knew that in Code World, I want 100% opt-in character death. Like, characters cannot die on accident. The player has to decide, yes, my character should die here. But you still need to have stakes of some sort. You still need to have a mechanic that says, here's why you don't want to get injured. Because injury is supposed to be a punishment, you know, it's a consequence. It is a reaction to not performing perfectly, you know. So it can't just be nothing. You can't say, oh, well, you're going to rack up damage, but you can rack up any amount of damage and it doesn't do anything. Because then it loses its meaning, right? But at the same time, you don't want to be like, oh, well, a die roll happened and it didn't go your way, so now you don't get to play the game. Everyone else gets to play the game. You can recover at the end of the session, so I guess go make yourself a sandwich or something. You know, you don't want that to happen. So I would be very hesitant about mechanics that, and this, I know I'm talking about like injury systems again, but it really does tie into recovery, because whatever injury system you're using, if you have a mechanic where the player like goes down and is out of action, your recovery system needs to be set up in a way that they can get back in the action quickly, easily. Preferably like, you know, like maybe they miss a turn, depending on, you know, how long turns go. Like it's a much different proposition to miss a turn in, say, like a Blades of the Dark thing, where like your character is, you know, out of the scene for a moment and can't do anything until circumstances are different, because turns go very, very quickly. Things are very different in a game like, you know, Lancer, or, you know, like late game or you know, late campaign 4th edition or something like that, where like, you know, rounds start to take a long time because there's a lot going on. There's a lot of bodies on the field. There's a lot of things to track. You know, if you're waiting 20, 30 minutes for your turn and then you don't get a turn, that sucks. So I would urge new game designers to take these kinds of things into account when it comes to designing both your injury system and your recovery system. It is my personal thought that I would always lean in favor of the player rather than in favor of like punishment. You know, that's kind of what the dynamic is there, or this what the dichotomy is. You know, you have things in favor of the player or things against the player. Things that punish the player for taking injuries, or things that benefit the player to allow them to keep playing the game. And I kind of always lean towards that. Because there's kind of there's like a standard recovery time, right? There's a natural flow to a lot of RPGs where you've taken injuries and now it is time to rest. Resting is like a break in the action where you can recover resources, including health, you know, remove injuries. And this might be like a camping scene, or it might be like go all the way back to town, get a doctor, days pass, that kind of thing. And I think if you're doing it that way, if like you have to go back to town and do a full reset to recover your health, then you need to have very light consequences for taking damage, right? Because if you consider the opposite, what if we have severe consequences for taking damage? You know, you are critically disabled, you're taking penalties on everything you do, maybe you can't act at all, and that won't change until the adventure is over, which might be more than one session, you know, depending on the game. Like some games go multiple sessions for a single adventure. That sucks. That sucks to play. And you don't want to rob a character or rob a player of their agency for that long. So if you're going to have that, then I think injury needs to be light. If your injuries are very heavy, you need to be able to recover faster. So it's all about building that kind of, or thinking about the player experience when you are building your injury and recovery mechanics. Now, did I do this for Song and Steel? No. So I think that So here's what I did for Song and Steel. And this video is running a little bit long, so I'm going to try to be quick. For Song and Steel, it is meant to evoke D&D specifically as a flavor, which means that I'm going to defy some of these general principles that I have described here. Characters do go down when your damage equals or exceeds your health. You are what's called broken. You can then, if you wish, take more actions, but you will die, or you can sit there and do nothing. Is this a great mechanic? No. Am I super duper happy with it? No. But I think it is better than what D&D generally does in the same situation, which is you don't have a choice, you just sit there and do nothing. And you might die accidentally. So better than what I would consider a baseline. Still not great. It's not ideal, and it doesn't follow the principles that I have laid out here. But healing is pretty easy. There are multiple classes that heal. There's the Warlord, the Bard, the Cleric, of course. Who else is able to heal? I think those are the 3 healing classes. And they can all do so pretty regularly. So and getting someone back up onto their feet is pretty easy to do. Am I going to do further updates to this? Probably. I mean, I've kind of been tinkering around with ideas for it lately. So I think healing is actually going to get easier in some near future update. In part because I have been prompted to talk about this. So thanks for the prompting. So yeah, in Code World, I think that recovery is going to be frequent and automatic. There's not even a roll involved. It's just when you rest, you recover, boom, and you're going to rest at these regular intervals. So basically every break in the action is what I'm thinking. But yeah, those are my thoughts on recovery and how it interacts with health and injury mechanics. And the point of recovery is to sort of not necessarily do a full reset, but to get the player back in the action to at least some degree. Because you don't want the player to stop playing the game just because things have been going not perfectly for them, right? You want to get them back in the game. You want to get them engaging with the mechanics again. And so recovery is whatever mechanic you have in the game to make that happen.